some of the enemy's fire. The Glasgow accordingly was ordered to get under way, but the wind having been laid by the cannonade, she was obliged again to anchor, having obtained a rather more favourable position. The flotilla of mortar, gun, and rocket boats, under the direction of their respective artillery officers, shared to the full extent of their powers the honours and toils of this glorious day. It was by their fire that all the ships in the port, with the exception of the outer frigate already mentioned, were in flames, which, extending rapidly over the whole arsenal, gunboats, and storehouses, exhibited a spectacle of awful grandeur and interest which no pen can describe. The sloops of war which had been appropriated to aid and assist the ships of the line, and prepare for their retreat, performed not only that duty well, but embraced every opportunity of firing through the intervals, and were constantly in motion. The shells from the bombs were admirably well thrown by the Royal Marine Artillery, and, though directed over and across our own men of war, did not produce a single accident. To complete the confusion of the enemy, the admiral now ordered the explosion ship, which had been charged for the occasion, to be brought within the mole; but upon the representation of Sir David Milne, that it would do him essential service, if made to act on the battery in his front, it was towed to that spot, and blown up with tremendous effect. This was almost the final blow. The enemy's fire had for some time been very slack, and now almost wholly ceased, except that occasionally a few shots and shells were discharged from the higher citadel, upon which the guns of the fleet could not be brought to bear. The admiral, who from the commencement had been in the hottest of the engagement, and had fired until his guns were so hot that they could, some of them, not be used again, now seeing that he had executed the most important part of his instructions, issued orders for drawing off the fleet. This was commenced in excellent order about 10 at night, and the usual breeze having set off from shore favoured their manoeuvre, so that, all hands being employed in warping and towing, the vessels were got safely into the bay, and anchored beyond reach of shot about 2 o'clock the next morning. So signal and well contested a victory could not have been gained without a considerable loss and suffering. It amounted in the English fleet to 128 men killed and 690 wounded, and the Dutch squadron to 13 killed and 52 wounded. Grand total 883. But the enemy suffered much more severely. They are computed to have lost, in killed and wounded, not less than between 6,000 and 7,000 men. The loss sustained by the Algerines by the destruction in the mole was 4 large frigates of 44 guns, 5 large corvettes from 24 to 30 guns. All the gun and mortar boats, except 7, 30 destroyed. Several merchant brigs and schooners, a great number of small vessels of various descriptions, all the pontoons, lighters, and etc., storehouses and arsenal with all the timber and various marine articles destroyed in part, a great many gun carriages, mortar beds, casks, and ship stores of all descriptions. Negotiations were immediately opened in form, and on the 30th August the admiral published a notification to the fleet that all demands had been complied with. The British consul had been indemnified for his losses, and the Dey, in presence of all his officers, had made him a public apology for the insults offered him. On the 1st of September, Lord Exmouth had the pleasure of informing the Secretary of the Admiralty that all the slaves in the city of Algiers and its immediate vicinity were embarked, as also $357,000 for Naples and $25,000 for Sardinia. The number of slaves thus released amounted to 1,083, of whom 471 were Neapolitans, 236 Sicilians, 173 Romans, 6 Tuscans, 161 Spaniards, 1 Portuguese, 7 Greeks, 28 Dutch, and not 1 Englishman. Were there an action more than another on which an Englishman would willingly risk the fame and honor of his nation, it would be this attack on Algiers, which, undertaken solely at her own risk, and earned solely by the expenditure of her own blood and her own resources, rescued not a single subject of her own from the tyrant's grasp, while it freed more than 1,000 belonging to other European powers. In August 1816, the strength of Algiers seemed annihilated. Her walls were in ruins, her haughty flag was humbled to the dust, her gates lay open to a hostile power, and terms were dictated in the palace of her princes. A year passed, the hostile squadron had left her ports, the clang of the workman's hammer, the hum of busy men resounded through her streets, fresh walls had risen, new and more formidable batteries had been added. Again she resumed her attitude as of yore, bid defiance to her foes, and declared war on civilization. Again her blood-stained corsairs swept the seas, eager for plunder, ready for combat. Christian commerce once more became shackled by her enterprise, and Christian captives once more sent up their cry for deliverance. In 1819 her piracies had become so numerous that the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle caused it to be notified to the Dey that their cessation was required, and would be enforced by a combined French and English squadron. His reply was brief but arrogant, and the admirals were obliged to leave without obtaining the least satisfaction. By menaces, however, accompanied by the presence of some cruisers, England, France, and the United States caused their flags to be respected. Ali, the successor of Omar, had died in 1818, and was succeeded by Hussein Pasha, who, from the commencement of his reign, evinced the strongest antipathy to the French power. In 1824 he imposed an arbitrary tax through all his provinces on French goods and manufactures. The consul's house was frequently entered and searched in a vexatious manner, contrary to the express stipulation of the treaties. And finally, April 1827, the consul himself, having gone at the feast of Bairam to pay his respects, was, upon a slight difference of opinion arising during their conversation, struck across the mouth with a fly flap which the Dey held in his hand, and in consequence soon after left Algiers, while the Dey ordered the destruction of all the French establishments along the coast towards Bona, and oppressed in every manner the French residents within his dominions. A blockade was instantly commenced by the French, and maintained for nearly 3 years, until it was found that they suffered much more by it than the Dey, the expense having reached nearly 800,000 sterling, while he appeared no way inconvenienced by their efforts, and even treated them with such contempt as to order his forts to fire on the vessel of Admiral Le da Bretonnier, who in 1829 had gone there under a flag of truce to make a final proposal of terms of accommodation. So signal a violation of the laws of nations could not be overlooked, even by the imbecile administrations of Charles X. All France was in an uproar. The national flag had been dishonored, and her ambassador insulted. The cry for war became loud and universal. Conferences on the subject were held. The oldest and most experienced mariners were invited by the minister at war to assist in his deliberations, and an expedition was finally determined on in the month of February 1830, to consist of about 37,000 men, a number which it was calculated would not only be sufficient to overcome all opposition which might be encountered, but to enable the French to reduce the kingdom to a province, and retain it in subjection for any length of time that might be considered advisable. No sooner was this decision promulgated than all the necessary preparations were commenced with the utmost diligence. It was now February, and the expedition was to embark by the end of April, so that no time could be lost. The arsenals, the navy, and military workships were all in full employment. Field and breaching batteries were mounted on a new principle lately adopted. Gabions, earth-bag, chevaux de frise, and projectiles were made in the greatest abundance. Maps, notes, and all the information that could be procured respecting Barbary were transmitted to the War Office, where their contents were compared and digested, and a plan of operations was drawn out. The commissariat were busy collecting provisions, wagons, and fitting out an efficient hospital train. A deputy commissary was dispatched to reconnoitre the coasts of Spain and the Balearic Islands, to ascertain what resources could be drawn from them, and negotiate with the king for leave to establish military hospitals at Port Mahon. 18 regiments of the line, 3 squadrons of cavalry, and different corps of artillery and engineers were ordered to hold themselves in readiness. 400 transports were assembled and chartered by government in the port of Marseilles, while the vessels of war, which were to form the convoy, were appointed their rendezvous in the neighborhood of Toulon. After some hesitation as to who should command this important expedition, the Count de Bourmont, then minister at war, thought fit to appoint himself, and his état-major was soon complete, Desprez acting as chief, and Tholoze as second in command. Maubert de Neuilly was chosen provost marshal, de Bartillat, who afterwards wrote an entertaining account of the expedition, quartermaster general, and de Carnay commissary general to the forces. In addition to these, there were about 20 aides-de-camp, orderlies, and young men of rank attached to the staff, together with a Spanish general, an English colonel, a Russian colonel and lieutenant, and 2 Saxon officers, deputed by their respective governments. There was also a section of engineer geographers whose business was to survey and map the country as it was conquered, and, says M. Roget, who was himself employed in the service we have just mentioned, and to whose excellent work, written in that capacity, we are so much indebted, 24 interpreters, the half of whom knew neither French nor Arabic, were attached to the different corps of the army, in order to facilitate their intercourse with the inhabitants. As the minister had determined on risking his own reputation on the expedition, the supplies were all, of course, of the completest kind, and in the greatest abundance. Provisions for 3 months were ordered. An equal quantity was to be forwarded as soon as the army had landed in Africa, and amongst the other materials furnished we observe, in looking over the returns, 30 wooden legs and 200 crutches, for the relief of the unfortunate heroes, a boring apparatus to sink pumps if water should run short, and a balloon, with 2 aeronauts, to reconnoitre the enemy's position, in case, as was represented to be their wont, they should entrench themselves under the shelter of hedges and brushwood. The French effected a landing at Sidi el Farouk, a small promontory about 5 leagues to the west of Algiers, and half a league to the east of the river Massafloran, where it discharges itself into the bay.